Hey everybody, it's your old pal Mike. I hope you're happy, healthy, and safe. And if you're wondering why you can't see me, well, it's because fretwork is the kind of work that requires a lot of focus and attention. Simply put, I didn't want to have to try to be entertaining while also having to think about fret extraction, installation, leveling, and crowning. So here's me, in voiceover, doing my best book-on-tape version of this process. Before we dig into the work, I need to talk about the sponsor for today's video, Stuart McDonald. Ever since I first started out as a tech, I've used StUmac tools, including much of what you see here in the video, and when it came time to dive back into fretwork after a 6-year break, I reached out to StUmac to see if they'd be interested in a partnership. To my surprise, they were, and they jumped at the chance to help me find and acquire the right tools for the job, and even provided me with a generous discount. I'm grateful for their support both as a customer and a fan, and I'll leave links to each tool I use in the description below. On to the job. If you've watched the other videos in this series, you probably know what kind of work I have ahead of me. This 1961 Jazzmaster neck has seen some things, man. The frets are incredibly worn with deep gouges from play wear and poorly secured with globs of glue, barely holding them in the board, which has a lot of tear out from a previous refret. The fretboard itself has a compound radius, although not at all what you'd expect. Instead of gradually getting flatter, as is the norm, it starts out at 7 1/4 at the first fret, but by the second, it's 9.5, and then back to 7 1/4 at the 11th. It's an unthinkable mod, and sadly one that removed too much wood for me to fully radius back to the vintage correct 7 1/4 radius. We're going to keep this one at 9 1/2. The neck also has quite a lot of backward bow from frets 1 to 3 that can't be dialed out with the truss rod, so we'll have to plane that out as we adjust the radius. Here I'm using my 2-in-1 precision notched straight edge to really emphasize just how much back bow there is. That'll have to come out, but first we need to remove those awful frets, so let's heat up the soldering iron and go for it. Removing frets without too much tear out can be tricky, but one surefire method is to introduce a little steam using water and a hot soldering iron. Here, I wet my finger in a little cup of water to my left and wipe it directly onto the fretboard. Then I use my iron and a little bit of solder to heat up the fret, and the resulting steam frees up any glue in the slot and makes it much easier to pull the fret with my fret pullers. This is the way I've always done it, and it always works beautifully for me, even with fretwork that's, shall we say, less than ideal. I repeat this process with the other 20 frets, and some come out more quickly than others, but overall, I'm really happy with the results. And even with a little tear out, we're going to have to plane this fretboard so heavily that it wouldn't even matter anyway. Now that we've got the frets removed, it's time to start sanding down the fretboard. To do that, I'll need a few things. First, I'm using STIKIT Gold Adhesive Sandpaper in 120 grit to quickly level the fretboard, and later 220, 400, and 600 to smooth out the playing surface. This paper comes in a wide variety of different grits that make it perfect for leveling boards, frets, bodies, really anything that you have that needs sanding. Here, I have it stuck to my aluminum radius sanding beam in a 9.5-inch radius. I have to admit, this is my first experience with this 18-inch long beam, and I absolutely love it. The added weight of the beam ensures even pressure along its entire length, and the radius is precise so you get consistent results. And best of all, it's metal, so it doesn't run the risk of warping like wood. Now that I've kicked up some dust, I'm going to save some of it periodically in a little Ziploc bag so that I can use it for fretboard repairs. Rosewood dust is an essential material in any luthier's workshop, and we'll be using it a little later on. The fretboard is starting to take its new radius now, although there are some areas not yet being touched thanks to the previous work as well as that persistent back bow. What I'm most concerned about is the area around each fret slot, so a slightly shallow area in between, well, that's not a deal breaker. The most important thing is that the board is level, and we're almost there now. Because I'm removing so much wood for the radius and level, I fully expected to sand through some of the original quote-unquote clay dot inlays. There simply isn't a good way around this, but it isn't the end of the world. My good friend Joe Riggio makes some of the best inlay replacements around, and I was able to secure some immediately after filming. After all of that sanding, we are about as level as we're going to get, and I'm actually really happy with the work so far. After brushing off excess rosewood particles and sighting down the neck, it's time to check fret slot depth, which I've done here using a strip of Teflon that I've marked with the depth of the fret tang. And what I mean when I say tang is that part of the fret that sticks down into the fretboard, keeping it secure and in place. Some of my fret slots are now far too shallow for a proper fit, so I'm using a fret slot saw that makes quick work of them. I take a stroke or two, then check depth with my piece of Teflon, then go deeper if needed. Now that piece of Teflon has another purpose here, to help me repair damaged fret slots from previous work, as well as the extraction process itself. I fill in missing bits of wood using a combination of StewMac tinted superglue and rosewood dust, and that mixture won't stick to the Teflon, which ensures my slots will stay clean. I allow them to dry for a while, generally about 20 or 30 minutes, and then I'm free to scrape them flush with a razor blade, then gently sand for a nice finish. Next, I'll be prepping my Fretwire for installation. Here I'm using StewMac number 148 wire, which is honestly my favorite shape and size on the market. I've asked for it specifically so many times over the years, and most of my guitars wear it, including Pancake. To prep this wire, I'm using the fret bender tool to pre-bend the wire to a radius that's just a little more curvy than the fretboard itself. This helps ensure that the ends of each fret will stay seated as they're hammered or pressed in, and also helps them stay flush with the board itself. Now that the fret wire is over radiused to about 7 1/4, 8 inches, I'm going to eyeball the width of each position and cut it to length using my fret snippers. This tool is massive and chomps through wire with ease. At some point during this process, I start wishing for a block of wood with holes drilled in it to hold my frets, so once I'm through, I go ahead and make myself one out of some scrap. This is a good way to keep the frets organized, and you'll see that I'm marking each fret position with a pencil. In the past, I've always hammered frets in, but this time around, I decided to finally get my hands on StewMac's fret press Cauls, which allow me to repurpose my drill press as a fret pressing machine. I have to be honest, I loved this so much more than hammering. I feel like this is so much more precise, at least for me, that I was guaranteed a tight fit against the board every single time. To press the frets in, I used the 7 1/4 radius Caul to really get the fret ends squared away, then went back over the entire fretboard with the proper 9 1/2 inch Caul to seat the middle of each fret. You can also see I'm using a drop or two of StewMac number 10 thin superglue to hold them in place. No way are these frets sprouting out down the road. After pressing, I went back around with my fret snippers and tidied up the ends. Usually I'm a lot better about sizing the wire precisely for the board up front, but I decided to play it safe for my first time around in such a long time. Here I took a cue from one of my favorite luthiers in the world, Danny West of West Guitar Works, who grinds his snippers flat and places some masking tape on the edge to protect the board while getting as close as possible to it. I've already learned so much from Danny over the years that I was confident this was going to be another life-changing tip, and I'm pleased to report it worked like a charm. Now before I can even think about leveling the frets, I needed to do some cleanup of the glue that flowed out while pressing them in. This is no big deal and super easy to remove using a fresh box cutter blade. Once it's removed from the surface, you wouldn't even know it's there, especially after the board is conditioned later on. Next, I use my fret and fingerboard leveling files to grind down those pokey fret ends. If you've ever played a guitar with sprouted fret ends, you know exactly how crucial this step is to the playing experience. One of the most crucial, in fact, given that you can feel those ends before you've even played a note, so it helps to take care of these right up front. In preparation for the leveling and crowning phase, I tape up the entire board with low-tack protective masking tape, which is thicker than normal tape and also has an ultra-low-tack adhesive, which makes it safe for all finishes. This is the first time I've used it, and I have to say I was surprised by just how low-tack that adhesive was, but I got used to it eventually. With the entire board taped, I marked the top of each fret using black Sharpie, which will let me know where the sanding beam is touching, but more importantly, where it isn't. Generally, I prefer to use a different color for higher visibility. Red, green, blue, purple, any of those will do, but all I had this time was black, so that's what I used. Taking that first stroke with the sanding beam and 220 grit paper was illuminating. Even with the board leveled and the frets beautifully seated, there's always going to be some inconsistency, but that's okay. That's why the leveling phase is so important. It's also important to take frequent breaks from leveling to check your work. It's a good idea to keep something like the fret rocker on hand so you can check how level each fret is in relation to the others around it. Using each leveled side, you can easily spot high frets just by the tool rocking over top of them like a seesaw. I'm at the point in this level where I'm focusing not on the entire fret, but rather on specific parts of each fret to really hone the level. Now you'll notice that at this point I've swapped over to one of these smaller wooden 8-inch radius sanding blocks. The reason for that is that I actually built in just a small amount of fall off into the end of the fretboard. This is an old practice where you slope downward ever so slightly at the end of the neck, which helps keep bent notes clean as you're playing them. Here I'm using that smaller 9.5-inch radius block to level the frets after the fall off, and the results were stellar. After swapping out for finer STIKIT paper on my sanding beam and just barely kissing the tops of the frets, it's time to crown. Now, I've had other crowning files in the past. Some good, some not so good, some that were so hard to use that my arms were sore from having to press much harder than I should have. This being my first experience with the Z file, I have to say, this ended up being the smoothest work I've ever done with a fret file. The diamond coating makes quick work of these frets, and the offset shape of the cutting surface naturally gave each fret a perfectly rounded profile as I flipped the file over and over. I was so impressed with this stage of the process that I joked with my wife, either I've gotten better or the tools have. And well, I'm big enough to admit that it's definitely the tools in this case. In fact, I barely even missed the 3-corner fret dressing file that I would normally use to get these frets started, which I completely forgot to order. Another cue I've taken from Danny West over the years is the slim width of my crown. The crown of a fret is simply the part that makes contact with the strings. Generally, the wider the crown, the less precise the intonation, and vintage Fenders feel the way they do, thanks in part to the slim width of the fret itself as well as its crown. On the Gibson guitars I grew up playing, this crown is generally a lot wider, and that gave those guitars a very different feel to my fingertips. But here I'm really aiming for a nice slim crown for playability, as well as more precise intonation. This part of the process takes a long time, so forgive me for editing here. It's tedious, boring work, so it helps to have a snack on hand, and even some of your favorite YouTube videos to keep you company. During the filming of this episode, I was watching Many a True Nerd on livestream try not to die on the recently released Fallout New Vegas randomizer mod. As always, it was hilarious. Do check out Many a True Nerd if you're into video games. After crowning, I turned my attention back to the fret ends, but this time, the goal is to make them as imperceptible to the hand as possible. Of course, you'll always know they're there, but the idea here is to round over the fret ends for a smooth fretting hand experience. Every tech has a different technique here, it seems. Some like to keep as much material as possible, only giving each fret 2 or 3 passes with their fret end file. Others like to take the extra time to completely round over the ends of the fret, which is certainly a beautiful, classy, and modern way to handle fret ends. If you've ever felt this for yourself, you know just how wonderful this is. Now, depending on the job, I usually land somewhere in the middle. This being a vintage guitar, I want things to be as smooth and easygoing as possible, while also retaining the vintage feel the owner expects. I think I struck a nice balance overall, and when I finally pulled the tape off, man did it feel good. The polishing phase is another one of those tedious parts of this job, at least for those of us without a buffing wheel. Normally, I'm left to do this by hand using some of my favorite tools, the micro mesh polishing pads. However, because they were so affordable, I thought why not give the fret polishing wheels a chance. For a first timer, these wheels worked out great. I really like how quickly the wheels and my Dremel took my crowns from freshly filed to an almost mirror shine, starting with the rougher of the two, the red, and following up with the finer green. I have to say, it took some getting used to, what with the variable speed of the Dremel, and also slipping off a few times, but I got the hang of it relatively quickly. After polishing, I decided it was time to take off all of that tape and give the fret ends one last smoothing with my micro mesh pads. These pads range in grit from 1500 all the way up to 12,000, so they are the perfect tool for bringing your frets to a truly mirror shine. And after doing the fret ends, I thought, well, why not see how much shinier I can get those frets, so I redid the entire board with the pads. I used a fingerboard guard to protect the board while I did my polishing, and in the end, I'm glad I did. Those polishing wheels were a great first step, but the micro mesh pads really made them sparkle. And it's not just about making them look nice. The most important bit is how they feel to play, and those pads, well, they really do give the crowns an incredibly smooth surface. If you've ever played rough frets that you can hear when you bend, this is a night and day difference. After finishing, I vacuumed up my work area, tidied up a bit, and gazed at my handiwork. After all of that, the finishing touch. A little dab of lemon oil on the fretboard to condition it after all it had been through. With the board freshly hydrated and looking as beautiful as ever, I had a look at what I'd accomplished. A leveled, perfectly radiused board with a top-notch fret level and crown, brought to a high polish and ready for years of play. For the first time in 6 years, I was staring at a fretboard that I'd brought back from the brink, and I couldn't be more proud of it. And yes, after stringing up for the first time in what felt like ages, it played like a dream. Ah, but you'll have to wait to experience the final product after the next episode, Assembly. But if curiosity has gotten the better of you and you just need to know what this guitar sounds like, you've been hearing it throughout the entire video. That's right, all of the music that you've heard in this episode was recorded on this blue 1961 Jazzmaster, and I have to admit, I did not want to give it back. It is that good. In closing, I'd like to thank Kyle once again for trusting me with his very cool guitar, as well as Stu Mac for sponsoring this episode. If you want to learn more about the tools I used, head on over to their website and check out the links in the description below. If you enjoyed this episode and want to know more about how you can support the channel, there is a link to my Patreon in the description down below. In any case, thank you so much for watching, for liking, for sharing, for commenting, and for subscribing. It absolutely means the world to me. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other, and we'll see you in the next video.